Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest. I'm so glad you're here with me today for another tale of betrayal, obsession, and aristocratic revenge. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing our community span across continents. Tonight's story takes us to the rain-soaked countryside of 1868 England, where a young woman has been cast aside by her own family, forced to watch as her younger sister claims the future that should have been hers. But what no one in that chapel knows is that the most feared duke in all of England has been watching from the shadows. And today, he's about to rewrite every rule her family thought they understood. They made her carry her sister's train. They seated her with the servants. They whispered that she was too old, too plain, too inconvenient to matter anymore. But when the Duke of Ravenscar walked into that ceremony and his dark eyes found hers across the crowded aisle, the entire wedding held its breath. What did he want with the forgotten daughter? Let me take you back to that gray October morning, where the scent of lilies mixed with coming rain, and where one woman's humiliation was about to become the beginning of the most dangerous obsession England's aristocracy had ever witnessed. The rain had been threatening since dawn, and Eleanor Hartwick thought it fitting. Gray skies for a gray day. Gray stones of St. Michael's Chapel rising like disapproval against the October clouds. Gray silk of the gown her stepmother had chosen for her, the color of ash, the color of something already burned away. Hold it higher, Eleanor. You're dragging Beatrice's train through the dirt. Her stepmother's voice cut through the murmur of arriving carriages, sharp as the wind that pulled at Eleanor's carefully pinned hair. She adjusted her grip on the ivory silk that cascaded from her younger sister's shoulders, lifting it another inch, though her arms already ached. They had been standing in the chapel's entrance for 20 minutes, while Beatrice preened before the crowd, and Eleanor's role was to stand behind her, invisible, a human pedestal for her sister's glory. There now. Beatrice turned her head just enough that Eleanor could see the satisfied curve of her smile. Don't you dare ruin this for me, Eleanor. I know you're jealous, but try to pretend you're happy for me. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence was her only armor in this house. At 27, she was considered past her prime, too old for marriage, too inconvenient to matter. Her father had died when she was 15, and her stepmother had wasted no time reshaping the Hartwick household to favor her own daughter. Eleanor had become a shadow in her own home, useful for errands, suitable for corners, forgotten in every way that mattered. Oh, there's Lord and Lady Pemberton, Beatrice breathed, lifting one gloved hand in a delicate wave. And the Ashworths. Half of London society is here. This is everything I've dreamed of. Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of being erased while still standing in plain sight. Beatrice was marrying Viscount Thornbury, a match her stepmother had orchestrated with ruthless precision. At 19, Beatrice was considered the diamond of the season, golden-haired, pink-cheeked, with a laugh that tinkled like crystal, and a talent for making men feel clever. Eleanor had watched the courtship unfold with a kind of numb detachment, knowing that this was simply how the world worked. Beauty was rewarded, usefulness was not. The organ music swelled, the signal that the ceremony would soon begin. Eleanor's fingers cramped around the heavy silk as they started forward, into the chapel where hundreds of candles flickered against stone walls and the scent of white roses hung thick as perfume. The pews were packed with England's finest families, all dressed in their most elegant attire, all turned to watch Beatrice glide down the aisle like a swan. No one looked at Eleanor. She was part of the scenery, necessary but unnoticed, like the flowers or the candles. Except for the man in the back pew. Eleanor felt his gaze like a physical touch, so intense it made her stumble. She caught herself, kept her eyes forward, but the awareness prickled across her skin like electricity. Someone was watching her. Not Beatrice, her. She risked a glance as they passed the rear pews, and her breath caught. He was tall, even seated tall enough that his dark head stood above the others around him. Black hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic planes. His coat was impeccably tailored, black wool over a silver waistcoat, and his cravat was tied with a precision that spoke of wealth and power. But it was his eyes that held her, dark as midnight, fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the chapel blur at the edges. The Duke of Ravenscar. Eleanor's heart kicked against her ribs. She knew him by reputation only, everyone did. Sebastian Moreau, 5th Duke of Ravenscar, was the most feared man in England's aristocracy. At 34, he controlled a fortune that rivaled the crown's, owned estates that stretched across 3 counties, and wielded political influence that made ministers nervous. He was known for his ruthlessness in business, his coldness in society, and the absolute control he maintained over everything he touched. He never attended weddings. Yet here he was, watching her with eyes that seemed to strip away every defense she'd carefully constructed. Eleanor forced herself to look away, to focus on the ivory silk in her hands, to keep walking. This was Beatrice's day. Eleanor was just the forgotten sister, the one who carried the train. Whatever she thought she'd seen in the Duke's gaze was imagination, nothing more. But as she took her place at the side of the altar, as Beatrice released the train and stepped forward to meet Viscount Thornbury, Eleanor could still feel those dark eyes on her, burning, assessing, claiming something she didn't understand. The ceremony passed in a blur. Eleanor stood where she was supposed to stand, held the bouquet when required, signed as witness when the vicar beckoned. Her stepmother had positioned her just out of sight of the main congregation, tucked behind a stone column as though even her presence might somehow diminish Beatrice's moment. Eleanor was used to it. She had spent 12 years learning how to make herself small. But throughout the vows, throughout the prayers and the hymns, and Beatrice's trembling "I do," Eleanor felt the Duke's attention like a hand against the small of her back. She didn't look at him. She didn't dare. But she knew with a certainty that made her pulse race that he was still watching. When the ceremony ended and Beatrice swept back down the aisle on Viscount Thornbury's arm, radiant with triumph, Eleanor followed at a careful distance. The wedding breakfast would be held at Thornbury Manor, and Eleanor's role was to ensure everything ran smoothly, to manage the servants, to handle any crisis, to be useful in all the ways that kept her invisible. She had just reached the chapel doors when a hand closed around her wrist. Eleanor gasped, turning sharply. The Duke of Ravenscar stood before her, so close she could smell the sandalwood of his cologne and see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes. His grip was firm but not painful, his fingers warm through the thin silk of her glove. Up close, he was even more imposing, at least 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to command the very air around him. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leave with me now." The words were quiet, spoken for her ears alone, but they carried the weight of absolute authority, not a request, a command. Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. I can't. The wedding breakfast is not your concern." His thumb brushed across the inside of her wrist, a gesture so intimate, it made her shiver. "You've played your role, Miss Hartwick. Now it's time to leave. You know my name." It was a foolish thing to say, but Eleanor couldn't seem to organize her thoughts properly. The Duke's proximity was overwhelming, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. "I know everything about you." His voice was low, rough silk over steel. "I know your father died when you were 15. I know your stepmother has spent the last 12 years erasing you from your own life. I know you've been sleeping in the East Wing servants' quarters for the past 6 months because your room was given to Beatrice's bridal preparations. I know you haven't had a new gown in 3 years, that you take your meals in the kitchen, that your own family treats you like an unpaid servant." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "How?" "Leave with me," he said again, and this time there was something almost gentle in his tone, though his expression remained as cold and unreadable as ever. "My carriage is waiting." Walk out of this chapel with me, and you will never be invisible again." It was insane. He was a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. He was the Duke of Ravenscar, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm. Eleanor knew nothing about him except what society whispered, and those whispers spoke of a man who destroyed anyone who crossed him, who controlled his world with absolute precision, who never acted without calculated purpose. "Why?" Eleanor whispered. "Why me?" Something flickered in his dark eyes, something hot and dangerous and utterly consuming. "Because 3 years ago, I watched you give your winter cloak to a kitchen maid who was freezing in the snow. Because 6 months ago, I saw you defend a stable boy your stepmother was beating. Because you have spent 12 years being crushed beneath the weight of other people's cruelty, and you have remained kind. And because," his fingers tightened fractionally on her wrist, "I decided the moment I saw you that you would be mine." Eleanor's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "You're mad." "Possibly." The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "But I'm also the most powerful man you'll ever meet, Eleanor Hartwick, and when I want something, I take it. The question is whether you're brave enough to walk through those doors with me." Behind them, Eleanor could hear the wedding party assembling, her stepmother's shrill voice calling instructions, Beatrice's laughter echoing off stone. In an hour, they would all be seated for the wedding breakfast, and Eleanor would be managing the servants, ensuring everything was perfect, existing in the margins of someone else's happiness. Or she could walk out these doors with a man who terrified her, who claimed to know her secrets, who looked at her like she was the only person in the entire chapel who mattered. Eleanor met the Duke's eyes. In their dark depths, she saw danger and desire, and something else, something that looked almost like understanding. "My things," she said slowly. "I have nothing with me." "You need nothing from that house." His voice was firm. "I will provide everything. They'll come looking for me. Let them try." Now his smile did reach his eyes, and it was cold as winter frost. "Do you truly think anyone would dare challenge me, Eleanor? Do you think your stepmother would dare demand your return when she discovers you've left with the Duke of Ravenscar?" He was right. Eleanor knew he was right. Her stepmother was many things, but she wasn't foolish enough to make an enemy of the most feared man in England. And Beatrice wouldn't even notice Eleanor was gone until someone needed something managed. Eleanor took a breath, then another, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, before common sense could reassert itself, she nodded. The Duke's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened on her wrist for just a moment, a flash of possessive satisfaction. Then he was guiding her through the chapel doors, past the milling guests who were too busy gossiping to notice the forgotten sister slipping away. His carriage was indeed waiting, black, lacquered wood with the Ravenscar crest emblazoned in silver on the door. A footman stood ready, and he didn't so much as blink when the Duke handed Eleanor inside as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The interior was all dark leather and polished wood, smelling of expensive tobacco and something indefinably masculine. Eleanor sank onto the seat, her gray silk gown spreading around her like water, and watched through the window as the Duke gave quiet instructions to his driver. Then he was climbing in beside her, the carriage dipping slightly under his weight, and the door was closing, sealing them into intimate shadows. "Your Grace," Eleanor started. "Sebastian." He settled back against the leather, his long legs stretched out, those dark eyes still fixed on her with unnerving intensity. "You'll call me Sebastian. We're past formalities now." The carriage lurched into motion, and Eleanor gripped the edge of the seat to steady herself. Through the window, she could see street. Michael's chapel receding, could see the crowds of London's finest still milling about, oblivious to what had just happened. "I don't understand," Eleanor said quietly, "any of this. You say you've been watching me, but I've never seen you before today." "I'm very good at not being seen when I choose." Sebastian's voice was calm, conversational, as though he hadn't just abducted her from her sister's wedding. I first noticed you 3 years ago at the Ashworth ball. You were standing in a corner while your stepmother paraded Beatrice around like a prize mare. Someone spilled wine on your gown deliberately, I think, and you simply walked away rather than cause a scene. I found that interesting. Eleanor remembered that night. Remembered the red wine soaking through white muslin. Remembered the barely concealed laughter. Remembered retreating to a balcony to escape the humiliation. After that, I made it my business to learn about you. Sebastian continued. Your financial situation. Your family dynamics. The way you've been systematically erased from your own life. He paused. I also learned that your father's will was very specific about your inheritance. You were supposed to receive £10,000 on your 25th birthday. You never saw a penny of it, did you? Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. My stepmother said it was needed for household expenses. Your stepmother lied. Sebastian's voice went cold. She's been embezzling your inheritance for years, using it to fund Beatrice's season and her own extravagances. By law, that money was yours. She had no right to touch it. The carriage rumbled through London streets, past elegant townhouses and manicured squares. Eleanor stared at her hands, at the worn silk of her gloves, at the evidence of 12 years of being made small. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Because I want you to understand something, Eleanor. Sebastian leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, bringing his face close to hers. You have been taught to believe you don't matter. You have spent over a decade being convinced that you are worthless, invisible, useful only for what you can do for others. But that ends today. I don't. I'm taking you to Ravenscar House, he interrupted. My London residence. You will have rooms of your own, servants who answer to you. Anything you need. And tomorrow, my solicitors will begin the process of recovering every penny of your stolen inheritance. Eleanor's breath caught. You can't simply, I can do anything I want. There was no arrogance in his tone, just cold certainty. I'm the Duke of Ravenscar. When I want something, obstacles cease to exist. But why? Eleanor searched his face, looking for some answer that made sense. You could have any woman in England. Why go to such lengths for me? Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes roaming over her face as though memorizing every feature. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. Because I know what it's like to be invisible, Eleanor. I know what it's like to be the unwanted one, the inconvenient one. The one who exists only to serve someone else's ambitions. His jaw tightened. My father was a cruel man. He had very specific ideas about what his heir should be, and I failed to meet them in every possible way. For the first 20 years of my life, I was reminded daily that I was a disappointment, a waste, unworthy of the Ravenscar name. Eleanor's eyes widened. The Duke of Ravenscar, cold, powerful, feared, speaking of being made to feel small. When my father died, and I inherited, I made myself a promise. Sebastian's gaze held hers, unflinching. I would never again allow anyone to make me feel insignificant. And I would never stand by and watch someone with Eleanor Hartwick's quiet strength be crushed by people too blind to see her worth. The carriage turned onto a tree-lined avenue, slowing as it approached a massive townhouse of pale stone and gleaming windows. Ravenscar House. Even from the outside, it radiated wealth and power. This is madness, Eleanor breathed. But even as she said it, she felt something unfurling in her chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been terror, or might have been the dangerous edge of both. Sebastian's lips curved into that cold, dangerous smile. Perhaps, but it's my madness, and you're already part of it. The carriage stopped, and he reached for the door. Welcome home, Eleanor. The footman handed her down onto smooth paving stones, and Eleanor found herself staring up at Ravenscar House in the fading afternoon light. It was enormous, 4 stories of elegant Georgian architecture, with tall windows that reflected the gray sky and iron railings that spoke of wealth so old it didn't need to announce itself. Sebastian's hand settled at the small of her back, proprietary and warm through the thin fabric of her gown. "Mrs. Pembroke," he called, and the front door opened to reveal a stern-faced woman in black bombazine. "This is Miss Eleanor Hartwick. She'll be staying in the blue suite. See that she has everything she needs." Mrs. Pembroke's expression didn't flicker. "Of course, Your Grace. Miss Hartwick, if you'll follow me." Eleanor let herself be guided into the entrance hall, and the sheer scale of it made her breath catch. Black and white marble floors, a sweeping staircase with a mahogany balustrade, paintings that even Eleanor's untrained eye could recognize as masterpieces. This wasn't just wealth. This was power made tangible. "Your Grace," she turned back to Sebastian, who was watching her with that same unreadable intensity. "I don't know what you expect from this arrangement. I expect you to stop calling me Your Grace when we're alone," he said calmly. "And I expect you to let me give you what you deserve: respect, comfort, autonomy. What happens beyond that is entirely your choice. And if I choose to leave—" Something flashed in his eyes, something possessive and dark and utterly uncompromising. "You won't." It should have frightened her. Perhaps it did frighten her. But as Mrs. Pembroke led her up that magnificent staircase, as servants appeared to attend to her needs, as she was shown into a suite of rooms more luxurious than anything she'd ever imagined, Eleanor couldn't deny the traitorous flutter of excitement in her chest. The Duke of Ravenscar had claimed her, and God help her, she wanted to know what came next. The blue suite was aptly named all cream and sapphire silk, with furniture of polished cherry wood and windows that overlooked a private garden. Eleanor stood in the center of the sitting room, turning slowly to take it all in, while Mrs. Pembroke supervised two maids who were lighting the lamps against the gathering dusk. "The bedroom is through there, miss," Mrs. Pembroke said, gesturing to double doors inlaid with silver. "His Grace has requested that the dressmaker attend you first thing tomorrow morning. Until then, we'll have suitable garments brought up for this evening." "This evening?" Eleanor's voice sounded strange to her own ears, breathless and uncertain. "His Grace dines at 8. He expects you to join him." Mrs. Pembroke's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Don't look so frightened, child. The Duke may be fearsome to the rest of London, but he's never cruel to those under his protection." Under his protection. The phrase settled over Eleanor like a cloak, warm and heavy and inescapable. When the servants finally left her alone, Eleanor sank onto a blue velvet settee and let herself simply breathe. Outside, the October twilight was deepening to indigo, and somewhere in London, her sister's wedding breakfast was likely in full swing. By now, someone would have noticed Eleanor's absence. Her stepmother would be furious, demanding explanations, perhaps even contemplating sending someone to retrieve her wayward stepdaughter. But as Sebastian had said, no one would dare challenge the Duke of Ravenscar. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. In the garden below, she could see manicured hedges and a fountain, elegant even in shadow. This was real. She was truly here, in the London residence of England's most feared aristocrat, because he had walked into a chapel and decided she belonged to him. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Hartwick?" A young maid entered, arms laden with fabric. "I've brought some gowns for you to choose from, if you'd like to freshen up before dinner." The gowns were beautiful, deep wine-red silk, forest green velvet, midnight blue satin. Nothing like the gray and brown cast-offs Eleanor had been relegated to for years. She chose the wine red and let the maid help her out of Beatrice's wedding finery and into something that actually fit, that actually flattered. When Eleanor finally looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized her reflection. The red silk brought color to her pale cheeks, made her brown hair look richer, made her seem like someone who mattered, someone who could stand beside a duke and not look like a shadow. At precisely 8 o'clock, a footman came to escort her downstairs. The dining room was smaller than Eleanor had expected, intimate, with a table that could seat 12 but was currently set for only 2. Sebastian stood by the fireplace, still in his black coat and silver waistcoat, a glass of brandy in one hand. When Eleanor entered, his eyes traveled over her slowly, assessing. "Much better," he said quietly. "Though you would be beautiful in rags, Eleanor." The compliment, delivered in that cool, matter-of-fact tone, made Eleanor's cheeks warm. "You're very certain of yourself, aren't you?" "Always." He set down his glass and moved to pull out her chair. "It's a lesson I learned young. Uncertainty is weakness, and the world devours the weak." Eleanor sat, hyper-aware of his proximity, as he settled into the chair at the head of the table. Servants appeared with the first course, a delicate soup of leeks and cream, and for several minutes they ate in silence. "Your stepmother will have discovered your absence by now," Sebastian said eventually. "I imagine she's quite beside herself." "She'll be furious." Eleanor kept her eyes on her soup. "Beatrice's perfect day. Ruined by my disappearance." "Good." There was satisfaction in Sebastian's voice. "Let her be furious. Let her understand that actions have consequences, that you are no longer hers to command." Eleanor looked up, meeting his dark gaze. "You hate them, don't you?" "My stepmother and Beatrice. I despise anyone who mistreats those weaker than themselves." Sebastian's expression was cold, implacable. "Your stepmother is a thief and a bully. Your sister is a spoiled child who has never been denied anything she wanted. They deserve each other, and they deserve to spend the rest of their lives wondering what I intend to do to them." "And what do you intend to do to them?" Sebastian's smile was sharp as a blade. "Whatever I wish. Your stepmother embezzled your inheritance. That's a criminal matter. I could have her arrested, her assets seized, her reputation destroyed. As for Beatrice, well, Viscount Thornbury is in debt to me. Significantly, I could call in those debts tomorrow and ruin him." Eleanor's hands stilled on her spoon. "You would do that?" "I would do far worse than that, if you asked me to." His eyes held hers, unwavering. "I told you, Eleanor, when I want something, I take it. And I want you safe, comfortable, and free of the people who made you invisible. Tell me what you want done to them, and it will be done." It was intoxicating, this offer of power. Eleanor had spent 12 years powerless, voiceless, watching as her stepmother twisted and stole and manipulated. To have that reversed, to hold her tormentor's fates in her hands. "No," Eleanor said quietly. Sebastian tilted his head, studying her. "No, I don't want revenge." The words felt strange on her tongue, but also true. "I don't want to become like them, cruel and petty and consumed with hurting others. I just want—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I just want to be free of them, to never have to see them again." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression. A flicker of approval, perhaps, or surprise. "You're remarkably merciful, considering what they've done to you. Or perhaps I'm just tired of letting them take up space in my thoughts." Eleanor set down her spoon. "You said I would never be invisible again. I want that to be true. But I don't want it to be, because I'm defined by my relationship to them as the stepdaughter they abused, the sister they discarded. I want to be Eleanor Hartwick, whoever she is, separate from all of that." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. No revenge then. But I will recover your inheritance, Eleanor. That money is legally yours, and I won't have you start this new life penniless." "This new life?" Eleanor repeated the phrase carefully. "What is this, Sebastian? What am I to you?" He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with that unsettling intensity. "What do you want to be? What do you want to be?" "I want the truth." Eleanor held his gaze. "You claim you've been watching me for 3 years. You orchestrated this entire thing appearing at the wedding, taking me away. You must have some plan, some purpose. I need to know what it is." "The truth." Sebastian's lips curved. "The truth is, That I find you fascinating, Eleanor Hartwick. I find your quiet strength fascinating. I find your kindness in the face of cruelty fascinating. I find the way you've survived 12 years of systematic abuse without becoming bitter fascinating. He paused. And I find the idea of keeping you very, very appealing. Eleanor's pulse jumped. Keeping me, yes. No hesitation, no apology. I want you here, Eleanor, in my house, under my protection, where I can see you and speak with you, and his eyes darkened. Eventually, if you're willing, touch you. The words hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and danger. Eleanor's breath caught. You don't know me? She managed. I know enough. Sebastian rose from his chair and came to stand beside her, one hand bracing on the table, leaning close enough that Eleanor could feel the heat of him. I know you're brave enough to leave your entire life behind on the word of a stranger. I know you're strong enough to refuse easy revenge when it's offered. I know you look at me like I'm dangerous, but you haven't run. Maybe I'm simply too shocked to run. Maybe. His free hand lifted, fingers brushing her cheek with devastating gentleness. Or maybe you feel it too. This pull between us, this recognition. Eleanor should pull away, should stand, should flee, should do something other than sit frozen while the Duke of Ravenscar touched her face like she was something precious. But she couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the sensation of his fingers against her skin and the dark heat in his eyes. I'm not asking you to decide everything tonight, Sebastian said quietly. I'm not demanding immediate answers or commitments. But I am telling you that I want you, Eleanor. I want you here, with me, for as long as you'll stay. And I'm willing to be patient while you figure out what you want. Patient? Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. You don't seem like a patient man. I'm not. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. But for you, I'll try. Then he stepped back, releasing her, and Eleanor could breathe again. The rest of dinner passed in a strange day's conversation about nothing and everything, Sebastian asking her opinions on books and music and politics with genuine interest, treating her thoughts as though they mattered. It was intoxicating in its own way, this attention from a man who wielded power like a weapon but offered her gentleness. When the meal ended and Sebastian escorted her back to the blue suite, he paused at the door. Tomorrow, he said, the dressmaker will come. Get yourself an entire wardrobe, Eleanor. Whatever you want, whatever you need. Price is irrelevant. I can't accept. You can, and you will. His tone brooked no argument. Consider it partial repayment for 12 years of gray dresses and hand-me-downs. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Let me do this, Eleanor. Let me give you the things you should have had all along. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Good night, then. Sebastian lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent fire racing up her arm. Sleep well, my Eleanor. My Eleanor. The possessive made her shiver. When she was finally alone in the blue suite, Eleanor collapsed onto the bed and stared at the ceiling. Her mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd been the forgotten stepdaughter, carrying her sister's train. Tonight, she was here, in the London residence of the most feared duke in England, being called my Eleanor by a man who looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was probably a terrible idea. But as Eleanor finally drifted towards sleep, wrapped in silk sheets that cost more than her entire wardrobe back home, she couldn't bring herself to regret walking out of that chapel. Not yet, anyway.